Okay. Um, okay, you can hear okay now? Okay. Doggone it. You bad thing. I don't know what's going on. Um, I got my newfangled one, and this is the one that, when it works great, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. Okay. Okay, doke. Let me tell you what I wanted to talk about today. But to get started, I sort of getting started in a different place than I thought. Um, One of the things that I always have fun looking for is trying to find a real hidden gem, something that sort of the herd doesn't want or doesn't care about or doesn't know about. And so it's always fun going out and finding. And one of the watches that is for whatever reason, because it's a good looking watch. It has a very sort of dress sport watch is the Bulgari Octo Roma. And the list price on those really isn't that bad for something by Bulgari. Is something like I think 7,300, something right around there. But I found them in the 3,000s at times, and right now the old ones are going away and the new versions are coming out. It's not a lot of difference. But the other day I found one for 3,000 something. It was a gray, slate gray, with a leather band, and then I compared it with the new ones that are just about to come out, and so it looked like a pretty good deal. And then what? Somebody, Aldo Sebastian, I think that was his name. Let me see if he's here now. Anyway, he said, there's something's wrong here. And so there were two companies. There was this jeweler who I later found out was located in Canada in the Toronto area, and they had three boutiques up there. And then there was this company, I forgot what was the name of it. Uh, anyway, this other company that was seemed to be handling their online stuff, or at least somewhat. But they had the name of the was Bandolier Jewelers, and then down below they had uh oh, that's anyway. It's on High Horology Lounge. There's a big thing that says caution, and the what we did was that this was located in, or at least they said they were located in Virginia Beach, Virginia. They had an address. We both looked it up on Google Maps. Nothing, it wasn't there. So, it was like, what's going on here? And so after later today, I'm going to call a Canadian store and say, "Do you know who these guys are and what are they doing?" Because they seem to be advertising everything that was in the Canadian store for 60% off. Now, 60% off is not a big deal. It really isn't, because if you've got your inventory and you got a bunch of watches that aren't selling, having something is better than simply having nothing. And sometimes they have inventory taxes and things like that, so people will really have a lot of reductions. In the case of the Bulgari Octo Roma, I really like those watches, and I'd gotten one for one of our sons a while back, and I got a really good buy on it. That was why when I saw the price. Now this is we there's sort of like pandemic prices and pre and post pandemic prices. There was something that went way up during the pandemic, and then the post pandemic prices starting to come down a little, but they're crazy high. To give you an example of that, the old adage, if a price is too good to be true, it usually is. Well, you have to understand what um, to be true is. In other words, when you see a price, and like I said, the more you know about this stuff, some of it sounds, yeah, boy, that's a great discount, and other times is that something is wrong here. So anyway, this is what right before we got started this morning, I thought, well, I put up a big caution on High Horology Lounge and explain these two. Now, here's the other thing: is that you've got to be very careful about accusing anyone of something illegal or something unscrupulous even. The jeweler is in Canada, and if you buy a watch in Canada, you get socked with the Canadian VAT. On the other hand, if you if you bought the watch in the US and somehow there was some kind of arrangement that the stock that was being sold in the U.S. came from Canada through this other company, that might be able to do it quite legally. And the guys running sort of the online shop simply were, not exactly the most, not so much. Oh, I don't know, shifty or crafty, but just lazy and stupid. They put the prices up and forget about them, and if something comes in, they somehow try to get it. I don't know what kind of arrangement they have, but the point is that sometimes there's you have two things. On the one hand, you have too good to be true. On the other hand, you have really good. All right. All right, so I wanted to talk about that a little, and if you want to see some details on it, take a look at the Facebook page, High Horology Lounge. All right, okie doke. So here is what um, what I wanted to talk about. How do we find really good deals? Um, oh my goodness, I got to say hi to everybody. All right, well, let me just say this, hi to my neighbor Alexander. uh, Aurea, Rolf, Jerome de Marseille. I love that. Big Sal, Caesar, Mark. Mark and Anthony are right together, so it sounds like hi, Mark Anthony, Dominic. Hey, Dom. Uh, Adam. Let's see who else we have here. Hi, Henry. Big Sal. Okay, Adam. Okay, Boston Collector. Let's see what Boston Collector's got. You got the new Octo Roma, fantastic, and the chronograph is also nice. Really great value. I agree. By the way, too, the Octo Roma, the movement in it is a BVL 191, which is a Bulgari movement. So that was another thing. There's something else I want to talk about too. Okay. Hi, Hater, Javi, Bill A, Walter. Good to see you, and Websy. Okay, I just sent a picture of this page to them so that so that my AD, and he says something looks fishy. Yeah, this is something can look fishy, but we got to get to the bottom of it. That's the other thing I think that is like, okay, so you got something going on. You have some kind of deal. Like I said, it could be a totally legitimate, and some halfwit could have put the address down wrong, and so we couldn't find it on Google Maps. But those are things, that's one way to spot something is hinky. So, that was. We'll find out more about that later. I want to give the jeweler a call up in Canada after they open. Which it's about. It's a little after 0800 here in the New York area. Well, Connecticut, northern Connecticut. We're not New York area by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so let's take a look at some of the things you look for. One of the things I love to find, you have these really fabulous jewelers. Like, well, Hermes isn't really a jeweler. Hermes as a luxury goods. They actually started with horsey saddles. You can go there to buy your fancy bridles and things. Um, but companies like um, Chaumet, and Chaumet, by the way, too, I just found out they dumped my favorite watch, the Dandy, but beautiful, incredible cases. That's something else I think that we tend to overlook. I do, especially because I'm such a movement, that the watch is the movement. Um, but you have Chanel, and then the big one. This is another big one. Let me whip this out real quick. This is my Daniel Roth retrograde. Okay. Now, the reason I'm showing it is because recently LVMH, that's Louis Vuitton's, they announced that they're going to start making more of these. They're going to bring back the Daniel Roth watches. And I'm very curious to see what they come out with because this watch, I mean, it has the horology in here. It's really amazing. And you have this retrograde hours that go back and forth, and some other things about it that are just like really brilliant kinds of horology and design. And I had I have another one that's a Metropolitan. It's a very unusual one. Not only it has your time, and then the one that's 12 hours different from yours, like New York and Bangkok are paired, and so they have that whole. I don't know why they decided on that, but it's sort of cool. And then they have another thing they have this little. Again, this is Daniel Roth. A little pin pusher, and when it's time to jump forward for spring, it jumps forward. And then when you want to fall back in the fall, you push the other button. You push the S for the spring and the W for the winter, and it does it in one thing. I mean, these are really interesting watches. He's got some other ones that they have a papillon that's just yum yum yum. But hey, people are finally wising up to that, and I think so. Maybe that might be an interesting development. Again, here you have a luxury company with watches. Now, one that I did a video on yesterday was Fabergé. Well, Fabergé is they had the famous Fabergé eggs, and the Tsar of Russia used to buy them all, and they developed some really world class jewelry. Then they started making watches, and the movements that they used were Frederic Piguet. And if you want to have a good time trying to find out about a movement, Frederic Piguet will give you hours and hours of entertainment. Here's what happened with Frederic Piguet. Frederic Piguet and Blancpain go way back. And at one time, the son of Frederic Piguet, I don't know, Junior, we'll call him, bought Blancpain. Now, here's a movement company buying a watch company. Usually it's the other way around. So they bought Blancpain. Well, God, what was it called? Before it was called Swatch. Swatch was called SSH or something like that. And so they bought the whole kit and caboodle. So they ended up with both Frederic Piguet movements and Blancpain watches. So they decided, well, let's change the name. We'll keep the Blancpain name because everybody knows that. And then we're going to change Frederic Piguet movements, and we're going to call them Blancpain Manufacture. So what you really get with a Blancpain Manufacture is a Frederic Piguet movement. Now, the Fabergé made life much more interesting because they came up with a whole series of names for the movements that were F F names. They were F for Fabergé, And so instead of having FP for Frederick Piguet, which is how the movements were originally slated, they're now F. And so looking at those movements, trying to figure out what is what, I I tracked one down and I did it by the width of the movement, not the width of the watch, but the width of the movement. I found this and this and this and this. Finally got it. Wrong frequency. Now I don't know whether what happened. It was most of the ones by Frederick Piguet were 3 hertz. This one was 4 hertz. So it's it's been a lot of fun trying to figure it out. More recently, um, Fabergé made life much easier. They contracted with Agenor to make their movements, and they started winning all these Grand Prix awards with them. And they also, for their everyday movements, or everyday watches, I'll say, they started using Vaucher manufactured Fleurier VMF movements. So those are, like really about if you're going to buy a movement and you're not making them yourself. Vaucher is one of the top places you can get them. Vaucher, Chronode, and then of course the ones that the thing about Agenor movements is that they seem to be all specially made for the watch. They don't seem to have we'll just pull something off the shelf for you. Like Chronode has some very good deals on that. So anyway, so that's one of the things. And so you go to Fabergé and you find some. I found some great deals there, and I was talked a lot about them. But finding the exact movement is not easy. One of the things I did do was to find out. Well, they stuffing ETAs in there, and I found out that they weren't, because there's certain things that the ETA has on their movements that you can tell they're ETAs. There's little bitty, um, uh, what are they called? Little punch that they put on. That has their like little logo, ETA logo. There was none of that. And they're usually hidden, and so I looked at all of the hidey holes, and they weren't there either. So I guess it's a Frederick Brigade, but trying to figure out which one it is part of what makes watch collection really interesting. Okay, so that's one route, is to go with the luxury brands that aren't identified. In other words, instead of looking for, I'm going to find a deal on an Omega, you try to find a deal on Van Cleef and Arpels, for example, would be an example that, here you have a tip top jewelry maker, and they make watches also. On the other hand, you have a tip top watchmaker like Omega, but they cost a lot. All right, at least for what you get, they do. Okay, so that's one approach. Now another one, I got it. Time goes really quickly. Another approach is to have. Let's see, what do? You wait until one of two things happens. When you have a line of watches and the watchmaker decides, okay, we're going to have a new line now. We're going to change things. If you get the old one, when the new one's coming out, often you can get some really good buys, and here's why: they're trying to get rid of the old stock so they can buy the new stock. That's all. That's all it is. And so when you find sort of there's a fissure now, right now in this post-pandemic time, people are buying everything because the watchmakers can't keep up with the demand right now. That ought to smooth out eventually. Um, as, as we all slowly go broke finding these things. So that's another thing. Another one that sometimes it can be, sometimes not, is when a line of watches is discontinued. I wish I had, as soon as the Rolex Prince was dropped, I wish I had grabbed one then, because they were really low, but now they've been creeping up again as people are recognizing that what a really good watch that thing was. The same thing with Patek Philippe um, gondolas. Those things are yeah, gondolas. Uh, that line is one I've always really liked. But the problem for me anyway was before 2009, they didn't have silicon in it. And so I have to look for ones before 2009. Another really nice watch, and these I don't want to get too much into sort of the antique ones, but you have, for example, speaking of Daniel Roth, I was looking at some Daniel Roth watches that were made while he was at Breguet. Now, remember, I think it was in the 80s or 70s, one of those two. The Chaumet brothers took over Breguet. Breguet was, as a watch company, I think they had a couple military watches or something like that, and they were sort of really on their hanging on by a thread. So the Chaumet brothers bought them, and then um, after about 10 years or so, the Chaumet brothers decided to corner the market on diamonds. They went broke. They almost went to jail, and they had to sell it off. And Daniel Roth went with them. There was a Singapore company, I think, who had Breguet for a while, but they also had Daniel Roth working for them, and they went bust. Something happened, and they had to unload it. So what happened was that um, Daniel Roth said, "Ah, heck with it. I'm going to start my own company," and he did. And this is where these watches came from, and these are from, I think, the '90s and the early 2000s. And so they became, before the pandemic, my God, these things are the greatest buys. I wish I had bought more. But then people, during the pandemic, I guess they had, they're sitting at home and says, "Oh, I think I'll learn about stuff for a change." And so they're out, they find out about all this stuff. So anyway, so those are a couple sources. There's another one too, and this is what I call the eye of the beholder. There's some watches that people just think are awful looking. I One example that comes to mind is the Audemars Piguet Millenary. Millenary's fine with me, but a lot of people say, "Oh, Jesus, it looks like a squash egg or something." They have all kinds of things. They don't like the looks of it. That's the way it goes. And that's not unusual, but they become hard to sell. One of my best buys I ever made was a Parmigiani Colpa, and I think one of the one of the reasons I got such a good deal on it, and other people weren't really in line to get one, was it had sort of a powder blue dial to it, and I was looking at the horology is instead of the color. I come to like the color. It goes with my, I don't know what. If I get a blue shirt, it'll go with it. Okay, let's hear from you guys. What are some ones where do you look? You're looking for some hidden gems. No, I know we all sort of go to places like Chrono 24 and eBay, and it's still a good idea. Are there any other places that is sort of like, here's a hidey hole? Oh, I know some, but sorry. Joma's shop has some awfully good deals. There's some companies too. Let me mention them in a second. Um, Joma shop, Shopworn. Shopworn is another one that you have some really good deals. But Shopworn, you never know what you're going to get. They used to have H. Mosers at one time, and they haven't had those for years. They also had Parmigianis. Parmigianis is this turned around. Um, oh yeah, there's another one too. I guess it's sort of related. You take the Vacheron Content 10 overseas. I had the OS1, and on the OS1 it had six, no, it had 8 horns on it. They're round and those little things that stuck out. And the movement in it was, I think it was It may have been a Frederick Piguet, and it had been a Frederick Piguet, and of course, Vacheron Constance says, "Yeah, yeah, we use that as a base, but really fixed it up," and I'm sure they did. But then in 2016, when the new one came out, it was easy to identify because they had the OS1 with somebody else's movement. They had OS2 with somebody else's movement. But then the third one that came out in 2016, the overseas, it had, first of all, it had 6 horns instead of 8. That's how I could always tell them very quickly on the overseas. So the other ones, that they would drop in price. That's another thing because when there was a really big thing, but the big thing that was different was that they had this new movement, the caliber 5100, great caliber. So that's another thing when when there's sort of a shake up, big shake up, not just a little change. Okay, let's see what you got. Hey, Jerome de Marseille, 2000 watches from Chopard, with gold micro rotor, limited editions found under 4,000. Holy smoke. That is a good buy. Um, yeah, Chopard is one that's always Chopard is a jeweler, I guess. They got a big jewelry component to them. I never think of them as a jeweler because uh I've concentrated more on their watches, but you're right, Jerome. That's a great place to look to go treasure hunting. Uh, Adam, LV, Louis Vuitton, the La Fabrique du Temps. That is a very important thing that they added. I'm very curious, and from what I understand, Adam, that they're going to have um, these watches are going to be built by La Fabrique du Temps. Now that would be interesting because the guys that they have some very top notch guys at La Fabrique du Temps. Okay, Anne Caffera, Voiture, Valfleurier, Canisi. Which is better for the entry level calibers? For an entry level, I don't know. I would go with Voiture, but on the other hand, I'll tell you another watch I think that you can find good deals on is the Chanel J12. There's the newer ones, and this is what you have to check. They have the Canisi movement in it, and if you turn them over, you can see it looks like something from Romain Gautier because it's got those round elements in it, and the Canisi. And keeping in mind that Chanel owns a hunk of Romain uh, Gautier, there may be some of that. That may the one that is and the prices are very good. The only thing is though is that if you get an older one, they'll have an ETA movement. But I forgot how many. I mean, you can sort of poke around and find out what year they started putting in the Kinesi. Those are nice little movements too. They sort of teamed up with Tudor on that one. But I think of those three right now, my pick would be Vasseur. The other two, Val Fleurier, I don't know about. It's hard to say. Val Fleurier, they're sort of like they were put together by Richemont so that they would have their own quote in-house movement. So Beaumont Messier, they have a Val Fleurier movement that they call the Balmatic. Balmatic, I think is what it's called. I don't know how good it is. It might be a really good movement. I don't know how Richemont sort of sources the designs of those movements. I think if they took, for example, if they took, and they have, I think, some from Cartier that were designed by Carol Forste Casapi, those could be like, really top top drawer movements on that. Hey, rancher, frying pan time already. God, I had to screw around with the sound for a while. Doggone it, I wish it wouldn't do that to me. See if I can find out. Blanc. Yeah, Giza, the problem with Blanc Pan and Breguet, I think if you go back, by the way, Breguet, if you go back to ones that were made in the 80s, you can find them the ones by Daniel Roth. And that's one I think you can find some good buys on too. Yeah. Yeah, they used for a lot of them. Okay, Boston, let me respond to this. We're gonna I'm gonna go do more of my fraud investigation this afternoon. That's what I want to talk about at the 4 o'clock. When we meet at 4, I want to talk about doing some detective work, and I'll be able to give you the results of this thing about. But Boston Collector has a good question. He says, "What do you think of the VC Chronomet Royale that has a Geneva seal?" Right now, most Vacheron Constantin watches, other than the one by Valfleury, do have the Geneva seal. There are so many. I am a big fan of Vacheron Constantin. I like their watches. They have this one with a double um, retrograde. They have a retrograde at the bottom that does a day of the week, and then one at the top that does I think the minutes. And I don't know. I guess there's a jumping hour in there or something like that. But yeah, those are things. There are a lot of other ones too that were sort of what I will call pre-vintage, and pre-vintage is before they go into a vintage category. And right now, I think you can go all the way back to the '90s to get what you can look at as pre-vintage. There's if you look at the way the herd goes, is the herd goes, they're paying way too much for some unimaginative watch, some of which are stuffed with silicon. Um, and then the herd loses interest and they go like that. Well, sometimes after they leave, there's overstock, and so as long as the herd isn't looking at junk, which they often do, um, sometimes you can find some really good deals in that way too. Wow, yeah, Tim's right. There have been in dealing with Larique and the watches that we're getting done, man, I've seen them run into all kinds of problems getting. Mainly, it turns out most of it's a labor problem. After the pandemic, people didn't come back. Anyway, guys, look, this afternoon, let's talk about doing fraud investigation. Anybody that might be fun, and see this so that we're not getting scalped. And I'm really sorry about my. I'm going to see if I can get this thing working again. And in the meantime, everybody be safe. Hope to see you later. Take care.